Returning to Wiley, although in a slightly different or from a slightly different perspective or looking at through a slightly different framework, we come to Rumor of War, a very important work of 2019 and interestingly of 2020. So what we're looking at here is a monumental bronze sculpture. Rumors of War is the artist's direct response to the ubiquitous Confederate statues and sculptures that populate the United States, particularly in the South. Sitting astride a massive horse in a striking pose, Wiley's young African-American subject is dressed in urban streetwear. Kehinde Wiley states that the inspiration for Rumor of War is an engagement with violence. Art and violence, of course, have for an eternity held a strong narrative grip with each other. Rumors of War attempts to use the language of equestrian portraiture, something that we've seen in the past from Wiley, to both embrace and subsume the fetishization of state violence. New York and Times Square in particular sit at the crossroads of human movement on a global scale. To have the Rumors of War sculpture presented in such a context, it was initially depicted or initially displayed in Times Square, lays bare the scope and scale of the project in its conceit or attempt to expose the beautiful and terrible potentiality of art to sculpt the language of domination. In recent years, the discourse and actions around these monuments have included efforts to better contextualize them and have resulted in both the addition and removal of monuments in more than 30 states as well as New York. What he's doing is he's making a statement against the Confederate statues and the statues of power that we see throughout so many cities. Statues that often are there to hold people down, that are often there from a different period and may not be just as relevant today as they were in the past. Think about it this way. If I have statues of Zeus all over the place, there are certain religions, and probably most religions, to be perfectly honest, they're going to have issue with that. They're going to say we can't have depictions of this past god throughout the land. At some point, it becomes no longer reasonable to have those depictions displayed publicly, and they move to museum settings or collections. Wiley is kind of saying the same thing about Confederate statues. Their time has been here, but it is time to move on. Now, premiering Rumor of War in Times Square situates Wiley's work at a global crossroads of civic engagement, where the black body of Wiley's subject can become itself a battleground for evoking change, and where the epicenter of Manhattan can become a space for citizens of the city, the country, and the world to come together to discuss the most important issues of our time. The project originated when the artist encountered the equestrian statue of Confederate States Army General James Ewell Brown, J.E.B. Stuart, while visiting Richmond, Virginia for the opening of his exhibition, A New Republic, in the Virginia Museum of Fine Art in June of 2016. A few blocks away from the museum is Monument Avenue, a nationally landmarked boulevard lined with the Confederate statues, including monuments to Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson. These monuments have a particular resonance because they function to continually commemorate the Confederacy. The state of Virginia actually has more memorials to the Confederacy than any other state in the country. As with so many Confederate monuments erected in the aftermath of Reconstruction, their function was meant to not only memorialize the dead, but also to reestablish a specific social order. This also accounts for the relatively few monuments that recognize women and people of color, making the Virginia Museum of Fine Art a powerful place to cite his historic work. Now, at the initial time that I wrote this material, it was 2019 and very early 2020. And so this piece had just been displayed in Times Square. Let's update things. The piece now, as of spring of 2021, is displayed as it was intended outside the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, a few blocks from Memorial Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Now, this is going to be important because since it was displayed, we have seen some changes take place. We have seen the Black Lives Matter movement come out and in part demand the removal of these statues. Here we see a display of the various street art and graffiti that is strewn throughout or across this statue. And even after Black Lives Matter finished, the message was very clear that these statues no longer hold a place on public display. Now, don't get me wrong, no one's arguing that they should be melted down necessarily, just that the context should be changed. And many people feel that maybe it's time to move them to a museum or elsewhere, and perhaps that's what will happen. Many of the statues, including the one of J.E.B. Stuart, have been removed by the city of Richmond. And this is particularly interesting because this is almost exactly what Rumor of War was trying to do, to call attention to this issue through art in a non-violent way and get these statues removed and replaced with depictions of people who are not traditionally depicted. Interestingly, the whole thing worked and worked much faster than anyone would have expected. No one in April of 2020 could have predicted the Black Lives Black Lives Matter movement, that's what I meant, taking off with such power in the summer of 2020. No one could have predicted that we would have seen the removal of so many statues from Monument Avenue. The Rumors of War almost becomes a piece without context. We need to understand it in this very specific period. It was created before any of this took off. We were, at the time it was created, discussing Confederate statues, but we didn't have the powerful movement behind their removal that we got from Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020. So in many ways, Wiley was wildly successful in his attempt to bring attention to this issue. And yet, it'll be interesting to see how we deal with Rumors of War in years moving ahead, because this may become one of those pieces that becomes misunderstood simply because it lacks the context, unless someone, a curator or art history students or art historians, talk about it and make this story well known.